Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yuracek.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Ana Maria Porras, and she is a professor here at the University of Florida. So I didn't have to go far to find this guest, but I met her a few years ago when she was interviewing for the position. And I really liked that. I think we're a little bit like kindred spirits. Also a science communicator, also likes to talk about the importance of science, but talks about the importance of science also in different languages, coming from Colombia. And so I thought this was really interesting. And so anyways, Dr. Porras, so welcome to the show. And do you want to introduce yourself better than I just did?
No, you did a pretty good job. Hi, thank you for having me. I'm happy to join you today for this conversation. Let's see what else was left out. Yeah, so I'm Ana Maria Porras. I'm new faculty in biomedical engineering here at UF. I'm originally from Colombia. Let's see what else. I moved to the US. It's going to be 16 years this year in August, 16 years ago, to study biomedical engineering. So that was BME itself is the reason I moved to the US. And then everything else, I think it will come up as we keep talking.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so just to get the science part out of the way, you studied the human gut microbiome. So what exactly do you study and why is it important?
Yeah, so in our lab, we study interactions between human and microorganisms. So I'm sure everybody has heard in the news things like, the gut microbiome controls your emotions, or the gut microbiome can control whether you get sick or not. And that all of those news stories makes it sound like we know a ton more about the gut microbiome than we actually know. So we know a lot of, the gut microbiome is associated with, but we know a lot less about how is it exactly that gut microbes control our human health. So what we do in our lab is we use our engineering skills to create models of healthy and diseased tissues. So for example, we study the gut microbiome. So an easy point to start is to model gut tissues so that we can study how is it exactly that gut microbes, for example, are involved in inflammatory bowel disease, right? Why do IBD patients have a different microbiome, and how do those different microbiomes that are different in diseased versus healthy patients, why do those lead to like more symptoms or more inflammation or things like that? So it's one of the things that we do, but we care not only about the microbiome, so the quote unquote good microbes, we also study some pathogens. So we're also building models to better understand how is it that, for example, in tropical parasitic infections, when people are infected with parasites, why do tissues change so much? Like, why do some organs become enlarged? What effect does the parasite have at the tissue level on us as humans? So yeah, it's all about studying human microbe interactions. And the other dimension to the lab is, like I mentioned, in tropical parasitic infections. I'm originally from Colombia, so I'm really interested in understanding the microbiomes and diseases of people who live in the global south. So people who are not normally the subject of study in the global scientific mainstream.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting stuff. And definitely this became much more popular recently. And we realized that, it's not just human cells. It's not just everything. I remember hearing a statistic, there's 10 times more bacterial cells or cells that are not you inside of you than human cells. There's 10 times more non-human cells than human cells in the body.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's a myth that has been debunked.
Okay.
So it was based on estimates that were not really up to date on what the average person actually weighs and how tall they are. Now we know it's really more like a 1-to-1. You have about as many bacterial cells as human cells. But if you think about it, that's still a ton of bacteria. And it's still millions and millions of bacteria that each person has thousands of bacteria just on their skin. And like another many thousands of different bacteria in their gut, in their intestines, etc. But yeah, like you said, this is really an area that picked up after 2005. So compared to other branches of medicine, it is way young.
Yeah, that's still really amazing to think about that there's so much of this going on beneath the surface. Hey guys, just a quick pause to talk about our show sponsor, Ripple Neuro and Neuromed. If you're a scientist looking to get the best quality data possible in your animal and human ePhys experiments, then talk to Ripple. Get a complete solution for your neuroscience research application backed by dedicated support. Be sure to tell them you heard about it on the Neural Implant Podcast. That will really help us out. Thanks. Now back to the show. But yeah, okay, so let's talk a little bit about your experience with science communication. Why is it important? Yeah, so how have you been involved with this?
Yeah, so I started doing science communication in 2018. I guess as a graduate student, I participated in a lot of things that could be categorized as science communication or public engagement with science, like volunteering at science fairs and things of that nature. But I consider really the more intentional start to my science communication career in 2018. And this was after, so I am not a microbiologist. A lot of people think that I'm a microbiologist because I study a microbiome, but I am really not. I started studying microbiomes in 2017. So it was really only a year after I started doing microbiomes. And it was a bunch of us who studied microbiomes where I did my postdoc at Cornell University. We were headed to the USA National Science and Engineering Festival. And at that festival, we were going to talk about microbes. And now here's the thing about microbes and microbiology. It's actually really hard to talk to people about them because by definition, they're things you cannot see. So, right, compared to something like, for example, like a neural implant, maybe you could have the device or something at your table and that would attract people. But how do you attract people to come look at a microscope when they, if they cannot see it with their naked eyes? And so that's when I had the idea. I had been crocheting for a really long time. So I had the idea of crocheting a few different bacteria and using that to attract people to our booth. It ended up working out better than I thought it would. And the other volunteers were using those bacteria to not only to attract people, but to explain different concepts about microbiology. And that was after that, I was like, oh, this is a great idea. I'm going to start doing it weekly in social media. Turns out weekly is probably too frequently for any one person to do sustainably, but I just stuck with that. And that's how I started doing science communication. And I think for those of us who worked in biomedicine, I think it's important for us to do science communication because we actually have so much knowledge that directly impact people's lives. There is, I think of it as like a responsibility to share what we know, especially because in academic settings, we're also funded by taxpayers, meaning we're funded by the public. We're funded by a bunch of different communities. And it is important for those communities to know how it is that their money is being invested, how it is that we are trying to make a difference in the world. So I think that's part of it. The other thing that I think is really important, and I think it's a lesson that we all should have learned from COVID-19, is that like our modern world, we're constantly surrounded by science, technology, engineering, right? Like we walk around with phones, for example, that are full of technology and engineering. And I just think basic science literacy, like understanding how the scientific process works, understanding basic scientific concepts is fundamental for like our normal day-to-day lives, for our lives as citizens, for our ability to make informed decisions, etc. And so it's also a right of people have a right to be educated in all of these things. And I think sometimes we see science communication and, oh, this is a way to convince more people to work in STEM. But I think it's important beyond that. Even if you don't work in STEM, it's important that you understand the basis of how we do science and why we do science. And some of the basic concepts of the kind of science that permeates our lives.
Yeah, for sure. And I've done a bit of crocheting, so I know that doing one a week is a lot, but it's a good way to visualize what you're doing. And yeah, definitely, I think that that's a big responsibility as being funded by taxpayers. You're essentially a public servant and you need to give back to do this. And, big part of that is like not wasting money, actually doing things that are useful and all this kind of stuff. This is a big part. So I think this kind of feeling of responsibility to give back to the public is very well placed. And then something that we had talked about before, and I thought that was really cool. You were doing this science communication and on a podcast or something like this. And then actually with another YouTuber that I know about. And it was a group thing with Bobak Ferdowsi, who's also known in the meme world circa, 2013 or something, as the ridiculously photogenic NASA guy. And he had like a mohawk with like stars on his. So you were on a podcast with him and with the YouTube host, Trace Dominguez. So yeah, what was it like being in front of a meme royalty?
When I was invited to join the panel, because I've been doing science communication for a while. And I have a couple of things that in the like science communication and social media have maybe gone a little bit viral, but I wouldn't consider myself to be like I'm a super major influencer in this space. And that has never been a goal of mine. And so I was surprised that I was invited to speak at a panel where like somebody of that caliber, like somebody that a ton of people now would recognize. So I was a little nervous, but funnily enough, in that panel, we were talking about science communication in multiple languages and the importance of that. And it ended up being something that I had way more expertise on than he did. So then I guess that participating in that panel was also a lesson in, sometimes you're like maybe more than you think you do. You have like more to bring to a conversation that you think you might.
That's really cool. Okay, yeah. So let's talk about the science communication in different languages. So he's Iranian, so it might be difficult to communicate a lot of concepts, and maybe there's not such a big audience, but the Spanish-speaking audience is much bigger. How have you done this translational interlanguage science communication, and how effective has it been too?
Yeah, so this really all started because after I started doing my thing in social media with the crocheted microbes called #MicroMondays, maybe like a month or two after, one of my cousins was like, I love what you're doing, but I can't understand anything. And then I started thinking like, oh, she's right. She's 100% right. And I started doing kind of a little bit of market research. So how many people could I find? This was in 2018. So when science communication and social media was really just starting. So in the United States, there were several people like in the English speaking world, but the more research I did, the more I realized that in Spanish, there weren't that many people. That's way different now after COVID, but before COVID, that was what the landscape looked like. And then I started thinking, oh, should I do a like same account and now you do translations? This would not be an issue now because now Instagram actually lets you translate posts right there. You just click on a button and you translate stories. So Instagram has come a really long way. But at the time it didn't. So I ended up deciding to create 2 separate accounts. And I think that's better because one thing that's really important when you talk about multilingualism is that a language is also associated with culture, right? So if you're just like simply translating things from one language to the next, or you're trying to serve too many audiences at the same time, it is possible that your message will get lost. So I decided to create different accounts because sometimes I would frame, maybe I'm introducing the same bacteria, but I would frame it in different ways. They are presented in ways that are like culturally relevant for people who live in the US versus for people who live in Colombia, where I'm from. And the more I did it, the more I realized how important it was. And the surprising thing is that it was important for the audience. But one thing that I've come to realize over time is that it has also been really important to me as a person and as a scientist, because prior to me doing that, like I said earlier, I moved to the US to study biomedical engineering. So all of my education had been in English. And so I had very little vocabulary for science in Spanish. And so it was a little bit like reconnecting to that part of myself. And it's one of the main reasons I continue to work communicating science in Spanish. And over time, I've also had opportunities to do this beyond social media. So working with organizations in Colombia, in Puerto Rico, like across Latin America and across the Latin American diaspora here in the US as well.
Yeah, that's very cool. So what's the reception been like? Have you taught anybody anything? How has this been going on?
Yeah, it's been great. So I now have, especially because of COVID, have more followers in my account in Spanish and in English, which I love. And so people that are not only in Colombia, but like throughout all of Latin America. This is another thing that really taught me about the value and the importance of science communication is last year in early 2021, when people were trying to figure out whether they wanted to get vaccinated or not. I did a series with my friend Javier Jaimes on COVID vaccines. And just seeing the impact that explaining things in an approachable language could have, right? Like I was able to convince multiple people to get vaccinated and to give those people tools to get their family and friends vaccinated. I don't know that I've ever done anything in science that has come remotely close to that kind of impact, to be honest, right? A lot of what I do is more basic science rather than translational. So right, in basic science, we know for most of us, it's going to be many years before we see anything that has like a tangible impact on our field or on humankind. And so this was like a lot more tangible of, oh, I convinced the person to get vaccinated. And so that has been a really nice outcome. I've also been in different initiatives that talk more about like my experiences as a Latina and as a woman in STEM. So that's a little bit, I still think it's like public engagement with science, but with a different emphasis. And that's the other thing. Some of the people who follow me, some people don't know much about microbiology and want to learn more, but a ton of people are microbiology students or microbiology professionals. And they just, I don't know, I feel like they connect with me more as like fellow scientists, and they want to learn more about tips to succeed. And so I think there's also a real thirst in all audiences. I don't think this is just in Spanish speaking audiences, to learn more about scientists. How do we do science? Why do we do science? More from a human and personal aspect rather than just seeing what it is that we do.
Yeah, I think that's very useful, especially I think for like kids and stuff like this, they don't necessarily know what it means to be a scientist. And I think like you said, the engagement, it's much faster. It's more immediate. If you're lucky, a paper you might publish might get a few hundred downloads or something, like a few dozen references, but you can get thousands of hits pretty easily on most of these social media sites. So yeah, that's very interesting. And commend you on your success with this. I think that this is really cool. For people who want to learn a little bit more about science communication, what do you recommend? Do you just say do it, or are there some tips, tricks?
Yeah, I would say a few. One, just start doing it because like you just get better with the more you do it. The other thing is, especially now when we're all so fixated on social media and metrics and like going viral, I always say there's a ton of research that demonstrates that we have the most influence over the people who are the closest to us and the people with whom we already have built a relationship. So sometimes we think of science communication and like good science communication as what's happening when people go viral, right? But it's really, you can do a ton of great science communication in your immediate community, with your family, with your friends, with people in your community around wherever it is that you live. So I would recommend actually starting from somewhere like that, like figure out in your surroundings, in the community around you, what is it that people need, and then build an idea around that. The other thing is try to identify who are those key science communicators that you think are doing great work, and try to figure out what is it that they're doing. There's several books that you can read. I'm blanking on all their names. Later, I could send you some ideas that we can put in the show notes, maybe. But for example, Alan Alda's, like the actor that has a big center, the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science, has a book and a ton of resources on how to get started. I think also courses that you can take if you want to get started. Right now, I would say if you are an academic at a university campus, a lot of campuses have courses or workshops that you can take to increase and improve your science communication. The American Association for the Advancement of Sciences also often hosts workshops that are freely available to the public, both online or say at their annual conference. That's one of the places where people can attend and learn more about this. I'm part of a community called Inclusive SciComm, and Inclusive SciComm also has a symposium that takes place every 2 years where we talk about all of these topics from an inclusive communication lens. So I feel like if you go on Google and start searching, you'll find a ton of resources and a ton of things for where to start. But yeah, my biggest advice would be you don't have to start huge. I think, and I feel like it should always be about what is it. And this is something that I'm personally struggling with right now, trying to figure out, okay, what is it that is my goal right now? What is the community that I'm trying to target? Rather than, I feel like when I started, it was like, oh, I just want to say things. And so being more mindful and more goal-oriented. And yeah, especially for the newer generations, I would say maybe try to concentrate less on likes and comments and more on meaningful interactions and the quality of those interactions.
Yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind. In these societies and everything like this, the SciComm and everything like this, is it useful? Did you find it good? And is it something is beneficial or necessary? Or how much of what percentage of what you've learned has come from that versus just doing it?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, by doing it, sometimes you learn a ton of stuff and then you realize it was all the wrong stuff. Because I think science communication is like any other scientific discipline. There are scholars, there are best practices, there are people who have been doing the research. So just like in any other scientific discipline, it's like important to acknowledge that there's like a whole ton of work that other people have done so that we don't always have to go and reinvent the wheel. I think one thing. Two, another really important reason, once you start going into science communication and you're learning more and more, another good reason to attend this conference is that you get to meet a ton of other people. And so you get to meet a ton of people to do new collaborations, new ideas. You hear about what they're doing and you're like, oh, I had never thought about that. Let me do X, Y, Z. Inclusive SciComm was the first place where I learned, for example, about how to make my science communication more accessible. And so things, for example, like including captions in all your posts, right? Including descriptions of images, things of that nature, right? Making sure that when you're hosting an event, that it's accessible to people who are in a wheelchair, for example. All of those concepts, I first heard of them from the inclusive SciComm community, for example, way before they were into more of the mainstream of like conversations that we now see people having on Twitter, for example. So I think there's multiple reasons why I think all of this is beneficial. And the other thing is, if you think you're doing something that's really cool, like in our case with Melissa Cristina Marquez, who's one of my colleagues and co-authors, her and I really wanted to get this message out of like the importance of multilingualism in science. And so these conferences are like a great place to try to convince other people that these are, and people who are doing this type of work, that this is an important topic.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, that's exciting stuff. It's good to have the network and then you can build off of that. And I attended one of these right before COVID, like right as COVID was happening. And unfortunately, I think it lost the momentum I would have had normally with it, but I thought it was really nice. So Anna, I think this has been great. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
No, I don't think so. I think we mentioned everything that I wanted to talk about.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.